Let's start tonight by stepping into the world of medieval peasants, ordinary people who somehow managed to stay alive through some of the coldest, harshest winters in history. Their lives weren't easy, but they were full of cleverness, strength, and a whole lot of determination. Before we dive in, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, only if you're genuinely into this kind of thing. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is. I always love seeing the mix of people who tune in. Now go ahead and dim the lights, maybe let a quiet fan hum in the background, and get ready to settle in for tonight's story. When we think of the Middle Ages, it's easy to picture knights, castles, and lively festivals, but the reality for most people back then was far from glamorous. For the average peasant, winter wasn't festive, it was a battle for survival. Every year, the cold came back like a harsh teacher with no patience and no mercy. Their homes? Picture tiny huts made from sticks and mud, with walls so thin you could hear everything outside. Yes, even a sneezing bird. Insulation wasn't a thing. Windows, if they existed, were just holes covered with stretched animal skin. And heating? Well, the inside temperature was usually just a tiny bit warmer than outside. If it was freezing out, it was slightly less freezing indoors. Comfort didn't exist. Nights were brutal. Everything went dark, the wind wailed like something haunted, and the fire in the hearth barely did its job. It gave just enough heat to warm the feet of whoever sat closest, and everyone else? They may as well have been outside, except with fewer stars and worse snacks. Clothing didn't help much either. Forget fur or fluffy blankets. Peasants wrapped themselves in rough wool, maybe a cloak that smelled a little too much like goat, and hoped layering would do the trick. Spoiler, it didn't. Beds weren't cozy retreats either. They were sacks filled with hay or straw, sometimes with dried rushes, often shared with fleas. The medieval version of luxury, apparently. The cold wasn't just unpleasant, it could kill. Hypothermia, frostbite, and other dangers were always lurking, especially for kids and the elderly. Making it through the night wasn't guaranteed. So if you woke up in the morning, it felt like a small miracle, maybe worth celebrating with a breakfast turnip that wasn't entirely frozen. Winter wasn't something to enjoy, it was something to survive. People layered up in whatever clothes they had, huddled together for warmth, sometimes even with their animals, and hoped the morning would come without icicles on their faces. And if you think your apartment gets drafty because of a loose window, you haven't seen anything. Medieval peasant homes were more like open-air tunnels with a roof. They were built using what historians politely call wattle and daub, basically woven sticks smeared with a paste of mud, straw, and yes, animal dung. Not because they were trying to be gross, it was just cheap, sticky, and easy to find. Still, no matter how carefully applied, those walls didn't do much to stop the cold. Wind pushed through every little gap, and winter storms laughed at their efforts. Staying warm wasn't just hard, it was a full-time job. And this was just the beginning of what they faced. Learn how to live with it, one freezing, uncomfortable night at a time. The cold attacked from every angle, above, below, and all around. Floors were basically just packed dirt, and when rain or snow came, water would seep right up into the house. Technically, that meant medieval peasants had indoor water features, but nobody was bragging about it. Walking around inside your own home felt like slogging through a frozen swamp. And don't expect any peace from the wind either. It blew through every tiny crack in the walls and roof, swirling through the one-room homes like it owned the place. Privacy didn't exist. Warmth was a fantasy. What you got instead was a crash course in endurance. The roofs, especially the thatched ones, might have looked nice in a painting, but in real life they sagged under snow, leaked after too much rain, and sometimes even welcomed local wildlife. Having a squirrel drop in on your stew was far from rare. Windows were either tiny or non-existent. A few were covered with stretched animal hide or wooden shutters. But forget about glass. It was so expensive that even a rich lord might only have a tiny pane or two. For peasants, just keeping the wind from tearing the covering off during a storm was a win. To cope, people got creative. They stuffed rags or moss into gaps, rubbed grease into the walls, and leaned into the magic of body heat, huddling close, sometimes with their animals, just to survive the night. It wasn't cozy, but it worked well enough to keep most of them from turning into human icicles. And then there was the cold that came from beneath. Floors weren't really floors, they were just slightly flatter pieces of ground. Sometimes people tossed down straw or dried rushes, which helped a little. But that chill still crept up from the earth like some quiet, creeping ghost, slipping into your bones while you tried to sleep. Anything you dropped on the ground during the night? Consider it frozen into the floor until spring. Straw made for decent insulation, if you could get enough of it. That often meant swiping some from a neighbor's field when they weren't looking. Even then, it flattened quickly, got moldy even faster, and added an unpleasant crunch to your already restless nights. Rushes were another option. Some families just kept piling fresh ones on top of the old ones. Over time, these layered floors became a kind of medieval mulch, filled with rotting plant matter, insects, and whatever else had crawled in. It was like carpet padding, if your carpet was alive, damp, and had a habit of smelling like a damp barn. Beds didn't help much. If you were lucky enough to have one, it was probably just a wooden frame stuffed with more straw or hay. No pillows, no soft mattresses, just a lumpy mess that poked and crunched and offered very little protection from the cold radiating up from the dirt. Sleep was less about rest and more about moving just enough to keep from freezing solid on one side. In the end, medieval peasants didn't beat the cold. They didn't have the tools, the money, or the materials to fight it properly. What they did have was stubbornness, grit, and the kind of humor that helps when your house is freezing, your clothes smell like goat, and your floor might bite you back. Living above the freezing dirt was never comfortable. A good night's sleep wasn't about feeling rested, it was about waking up with all your toes still there. If you pulled that off, you were already ahead of the game. When it came to surviving winter in a medieval peasant home, the walls, roof, and packed dirt floors weren't the heroes. The real MVP was the hearth. At the heart of nearly every peasant home was a fire, simple, stubborn, and absolutely essential. Not some tidy fireplace with a carved mantel or a chimney puffing smoke elegantly into the sky. Just a shallow pit or a ring of stones, a few half-burned logs, and a whole lot of smoke swirling into the room like it had nowhere better to be. Chimneys? Most homes didn't even bother. The smoke floated out through holes in the roof or cracks in the walls, or, on bad nights, just sat in the room with you. It was awful for your lungs and probably shaved years off your life. But hey, it did a great job getting rid of fleas. Who needs pest control when you're basically living inside a low and slow smokehouse? The hearth wasn't just about staying warm. It doubled as the kitchen, the main source of light, and the evening entertainment. Families gathered around it to cook, tell stories, trade gossip, or simply stare into the flames because, well, there wasn't anything else to do once the sun went down. That flickering fire was the only thing standing between the family and the bone-deep cold outside. Letting the fire go out at night wasn't just careless, it was dangerous. Starting it back up wasn't as easy as striking a match. Matches didn't exist. Neither did lighters. Reigniting a fire in the middle of winter meant fumbling around half asleep with frozen fingers, scraping flint and steel together, and praying for just one spark to catch on whatever kindling you hadn't already burned 3 nights ago. So, peasants got smart. They didn't try to keep the fire roaring all night. Instead, they banked it. That meant carefully covering the glowing embers with a thick layer of ash before bed. The ash worked like a blanket, holding in just enough heat to keep the coals alive until morning. Done right, you could walk over at sunrise, poke the pile, throw on some wood, and boom, instant fire, no frostbite required. Done wrong? Mornings got colder, longer, and a whole lot grumpier. Firebanking was a skill every family passed down like a treasured recipe. Some swore you had to use only dry ash. Others had tricks for stacking the coals just so. Everyone had their method because in the end, this tiny fire wasn't just a tool. It was the home's beating heart, flickering stubbornly against a world that wanted nothing more than to snuff it out. And when winter was howling outside your walls, no one feared anything quite as much as waking up to a dead hearth. Not even running out of ale came close. It made perfect sense to move anything warm and breathing inside. Cows, goats, pigs, chickens, if it could raise the room temperature even a fraction, it was welcome to join the sleepover. This wasn't about being quirky or rustic. It was about staying alive. A medieval winter household could feel more like a barn than a home. People, animals, and the cold all packed into one dim, smoky space. Livestock wandered freely, sometimes stepping on toes or knocking things over, and yes, sometimes even tumbling into the hearth. But every animal brought a little heat to the table, or rather to the floor. Privacy didn't exist. Comfort was a luxury, but warmth, that was a shared mission. Entire families bundled together in the warmest corner of the room, layered in every piece of cloth they could find. The goal wasn't a good night's rest. It was to not wake up frozen stiff. You didn't sleep alone. You slept stacked, side by side, forming what could only be described as a chaotic, snoring human lasagna. Kids nestled between parents, grandparents curled up on the edge, and if a neighbor or surprise relative dropped by, well, you made room. The lucky ones slept in the middle, soaking up warmth from all sides. The unlucky ones, stuck on the edge, shivering in the draft, and praying someone would scoot over. And if you accidentally rolled the wrong way and pushed someone toward the cold wall, especially someone older, congrats, you were the family villain until spring. Even bedding was shared. A big, flattened sack of straw became the communal mattress, slowly compressing under the weight of generations. Cleanliness wasn't really part of the equation. The smells were, let's just say, memorable. But when frostbite was knocking, no one cared if the bedding was fragrant or not. People even got strategic about how they slept. Some guides suggested putting the strongest and warmest folks on the outside to block the cold like human shields, while the frail, the very young, and the elderly were placed at the center, kept warm like treasured embers. This wasn't just about getting through the night. It was about protecting your people. And through all this, something kind of beautiful happened. Huddling together didn't just keep people alive, it brought them closer, literally and emotionally. Those long freezing nights led to stories, songs, whispered jokes, and sleepy conversations under shared blankets. Families bonded in the glow of the hearth and the warmth of each other. So the next time your pet steals your pillow or your sibling hogs the duvet, take a deep breath and remember, it could be worse. You could be elbow to elbow with 5 relatives, 3 farm animals, and a goose that's giving you side-eye because you sneezed. Medieval winters weren't pretty, but they were full of scrappy teamwork, creativity, and a whole lot of very cozy chaos. Puppets than anything you'd actually want on your hands, but they did the job. Sort of. As long as your fingers didn't turn blue, they were considered a success. Every layer mattered. Every rag, every scrap, every patch of wool was another barrier between a peasant and the icy fingers of winter. Style wasn't even a consideration. If it covered skin, it was on your body. If it didn't cover skin, you wrapped something else around it and kept moving. Looking good was a luxury for summer. Winter was about survival. And if your goat happened to be pressed up against your side, bonus points. Not only was it a little space heater with hooves, but it was also less likely to vanish during the night, goat theft being a real concern when everyone's hungry and desperate. Having your animals inside wasn't just a heat strategy, it was basic home security. Smelly, noisy, and full of hoof-related hazards, but effective. Nights in a medieval home turned into a living, snoring, shuffling furnace. Chickens settled into corners, sometimes curling up in baskets or rafters. Pigs snored loudly by the fire, completely unbothered by anyone's personal space. Cows, the biggest and warmest of the bunch, lounged near the family, ruminating like royalty. They didn't pay rent, but they paid in warmth, which was priceless. Goats, of course, went wherever they pleased. You could try to block them out, but goats had opinions and surprisingly good balance. It was messy, it was noisy, and the smells, legendary. By the time spring arrived, everyone was marinated in a powerful blend of livestock, smoke, sweat, and wet wool. Lighting a candle would have been redundant, but people didn't complain much. They couldn't afford to. They knew the equation. More animals inside meant fewer frostbitten limbs by morning. Sure, sharing a room with farm animals came with risks. You might wake up to a chicken pecking your scalp or step in something cold and squishy on your way to the door. Maybe a pig blocked your path. Maybe you rolled into a cow mid-dream. It wasn't ideal, but it was warmer than the alternative, and in the end, that's what counted. Because in winter, the rules changed. Survival meant turning your home into a barn, wearing every piece of clothing you owned, and hoping that between the layers of wool, the wall of livestock, and the tiny flickering hearth, you could outlast the cold for one more night. Blend of bedding and nature that brought you closer, perhaps too close, to the outdoors. It wasn't unusual to wake up with a new flea bite or some questionable dampness soaking into your blanket, but hey, it beat freezing to death. Medieval beds weren't about comfort, they were about not dying. If it kept you off the frozen ground and slightly warmer than you would have been otherwise, it was good enough. And if you shared that bed with your entire family and maybe a pig or two, even better. More bodies meant more heat. Children were bundled up like overstuffed turnips, waddling around the house with barely any ability to bend their arms. The more layers, the better. They didn't look cute or graceful. They looked like laundry bags with legs. But warmth was all that mattered. Forget style. In the medieval world, wearing 5 outfits at once and smelling like you'd never met a bar of soap was the height of winter fashion. And speaking of soap, nobody was using it unless it was a special occasion. Maybe the bishop was visiting. Maybe you were on your deathbed. Otherwise, cleanliness took a hard back seat to survival. Washing clothes in the middle of winter meant smashing through ice in a stream and hoping your shirt didn't freeze into a crispy plank before it dried 3 days later. Most peasants figured it was better to keep wearing their existing layers, dirt and all. This grime had a purpose. As clothing collected layers of dirt, sweat, oils, and the occasional splash of mystery mud, it actually became more wind-resistant. That grimy film filled the gaps in the fabric, turning scratchy linen into something that could almost pass for insulation. It was medieval Gore-Tex, if Gore-Tex smelled like old goats and cabbage stew. Peasants didn't just throw on clean layers every day. They built their outfits like sedimentary rock, each layer a historical artifact from earlier in the season. A new cloak went right over last month's tunic, which still bore the heroic stain from slipping in the mud during chores. It wasn't lazy. It was smart. That crusty outer shell kept the cold out better than anything fresh off a laundry line. So while outsiders might have seen a group of dirty, smelly people who looked like they'd given up, peasants knew the truth. That dirt was armor. That stink was strategy. If you made it to February with a greasy layer of warmth and most of your toes still attached, you weren't just surviving, you were winning. Because in a world with no central heating, no hot showers, and no fluffy beds, every stinky tunic and every shared mattress was a small triumph over the cold. Medieval winter wasn't about comfort. It was about grit, resourcefulness, and just enough insulation, natural or otherwise, to live to see the spring. That nature could throw at them. Their homes weren't cozy. They were crumbling bundles of desperation held together by willpower, straw, and whatever junk they could get their hands on. But against all odds, they made it work. Sleeping arrangements were about as rustic as it gets. A pile of straw on a wooden frame, or just on the dirt floor, was your bed. Influencers today might call it earth-connected slumber, but peasants knew it for what it was: lumpy, damp, itchy, and full of bugs. That straw flattened over time, grew moldy, and invited a thriving population of fleas and lice. Changing the bedding wasn't a weekly chore. It was a seasonal event, or something you did only when your mattress started wiggling without you. Some homes used rushes instead, long grasses sometimes mixed with herbs like lavender or rosemary to try and fail, to mask the constant smell of livestock and living too close to your own shoes. For about 24 hours, the place smelled great. Then the rushes turned into part of the muddy, food-stained, critter-infested mess covering the floor. Welcome to home sweet home. Still, these scratchy, slightly alive beds were lifesavers. Piles of straw offered insulation from the freezing ground, and people huddled together on top of them to share warmth. It wasn't glamorous, but it was effective. Medieval central heating powered by body heat and mutual suffering. So the next time you climb into a soft mattress with clean sheets, just remember, somewhere, a medieval peasant is cackling through missing teeth and whispering, "Must be nice." Of course, the bed was only part of the war against winter. When your house is made of sticks, mud, and hope, even a gentle breeze feels like a personal attack. Walls cracked, thatch sagged, and mud crumbled. The cold wasn't just something outside, It moved in, set up shop, and refused to leave. To fight back, peasants stuffed gaps with whatever they had on hand. Moss, straw, old cloth, grass, animal hair. If it could fill a hole, it got jammed in there. Some even smeared extra mud and manure on the outside walls in a desperate attempt to reinforce their homes for winter. Imagine doing that in freezing temperatures, slapping frozen dung onto your house and convincing yourself it counted as home improvement. Roofs weren't spared either. Thatched roofing was cheap and easy to get, but waterproof? Not really. After a couple seasons, leaks were everywhere. Peasants plugged holes with whatever they could find, old rags, reeds, or bits of turf yanked from a nearby field. After a while, every roof looked like a patchwork quilt sewn together by someone who got bored halfway through. Doors and windows, if you had them, weren't much better. Wooden planks barely clung in place, and window holes were covered with whatever could block the wind. Animal hides, fat-soaked cloth, maybe a lucky piece of old blanket. Bonus, everything now smelled faintly of roasted meat, even if you hadn't eaten in days. Every night was a new round of hide-and-seek with the cold. Just when you thought you'd sealed everything up, a sudden gust would find the one hole you missed and slap you in the face like winter itself was personally offended by your existence. But despite all of this, medieval peasants didn't give up. They patched, they stuffed, they slapped mud, and prayed. They didn't accept slightly frozen as normal. Through sheer grit, stubbornness, and an endless battle of wits against the weather, they made it. Not comfortably, not cleanly, but they survived. One smoky, muddy, goat-scented winter at a time. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Medieval peasants didn't have cozy cottages or roaring fireplaces. What they had were crumbling huts made of mud, sticks, and pure determination, barely holding together under the weight of winter. But somehow, against everything nature hurled at them, they held on. Their beds? Forget soft pillows and warm duvets. Most people slept on a heap of straw, maybe on a wooden frame if they were lucky, or just dumped straight onto the packed dirt floor. It wasn't charming. It was itchy, damp, and full of creatures you didn't invite. That straw broke down fast, turning moldy, flat, and eventually becoming a playground for fleas and lice. Changing it out happened only a few times a year, or when the bedding started moving on its own. Some tried rushes instead, long grasses sometimes sprinkled with herbs like rosemary or lavender to try and mask the strong eau de barnyard that clung to every corner of the house. The fresh smell lasted for a day. Then it mixed with the usual mess of tracked-in mud, spilled food, and livestock droppings to form the thick, earthy perfume of peasant life. Still, those scratchy piles of straw and rushes were more than just sad excuses for mattresses. They were lifesavers. They kept people off the freezing ground, and when you packed enough bodies on top, you had something close to central heating. Not stylish, not comfortable, but absolutely essential. So next time you're cozy in bed, think of some peasant wrapped in old wool, grinning with gapped teeth and muttering, "Must be nice." But beds were just the beginning. The real battle was the house itself. When your home is built from hope and cow dung, even the smallest breeze feels like an insult. The walls cracked, the roof sagged, the cold didn't knock, it barged in and stayed for dinner. Peasants fought back however they could. They stuffed every gap with moss, rags, straw, grass, anything soft and vaguely warm. Animal hair? Sure. Mud? Absolutely. In winter, some would even smear fresh layers of manure on the walls, building a cold-resistant crust with their own hands. Imagine standing in the freezing air, slapping dung on your house while telling yourself, "This is fine. This is how we win." And then there were the roofs. Thatch was cheap and available, but also kind of terrible at staying waterproof. After a few storms, leaks opened up everywhere. People patched holes with whatever they had, old bits of cloth, reed bundles, or in moments of true panic, turf stolen from a nearby field. In time, the roof started to look like someone had tried to make a quilt, using only desperation and swamp moss. Doors and windows were hardly better. A door might be a warped wood plank hanging on rusty nails. A window was usually just a hole covered with animal skin or fabric soaked in fat to block the wind. The smell? Think smoked meat, minus the meat. Every night was a test. One moment you were warm, the next a gust found some crack you missed, and suddenly winter was slapping you awake with a vengeance. It was a game of survival. patch stuff, slap on more mud, repeat. But despite all that, medieval peasants kept going. They didn't quit. They didn't let the cold win. With whatever they had, no matter how gross, strange, or smelly, they got through the long months of ice and wind. Not with comfort, but with creativity, grit, and the kind of stubbornness that can outlast a blizzard. No running water, no heaters, no luxury, just smoke, straw, manure, and the will to see spring again. One shivering, goat-scented night at a time. Could stay toasty till dinner, and sometimes, if you were really clever, you'd tuck it under the bed or near your feet for a little extra warmth. It was medieval multitasking, dinner storage and DIY foot warmer all in one. The hay acted as natural insulation, trapping the heat and turning an ordinary box into a budget-friendly thermal powerhouse. Then there were heated stones, literally rocks that were warmed in the hearth, then carefully wrapped in cloth or stuffed into sacks to avoid burns. These stones were tucked into beds before you crawled in, radiating heat just long enough to take the icy edge off. It wasn't luxury, but after a day of frozen toes and goat-scented draft breezes, it felt like a miracle. Families even rotated their best rocks. Yes, that was a thing. You had the good stone, the one that held heat longer, and heaven help you if someone snuck it out of your bedding pile. Heated stones became bedtime gold. In homes with more than one person, read all of them, the stones were shared, swapped, and sometimes even argued over. These simple tricks didn't banish the cold, but they took the edge off. That meant fewer frozen fingers in the morning, fewer nights of shivering so hard you rattled the straw, and maybe, just maybe, a slightly better chance of waking up still breathing. Meanwhile, children were learning the fine art of winter survival right alongside the adults. Parents weren't just worried about warmth, they were managing breath control like their kids were about to audition for a medieval monastery choir. Don't pant indoors was serious advice. Breathing too hard let out precious body heat, and when the temperature inside your home was only marginally better than outside, every degree mattered. Wearing layers that itched, sleeping next to flatulent livestock, and learning how to breathe slowly through your nose, all part of growing up medieval. If you survived childhood without frostbite and with at least half your hearing after sharing a room with a snoring cow, you were doing fine. And while breath control and hay boxes helped, one of the most effective survival tactics was just food. Heavy, dense, no-nonsense food. A big meal before bed meant your body had something to work on all night, generating warmth as it digested. Dinner in winter wasn't light or fancy. It was stew packed with root veggies like onions, turnips, and parsnips. Grains like oats and barley were staples. Thick rye bread could fill your stomach like a brick, exactly the point. On special days, you might even get some salted meat or dried sausage tossed in. It wasn't gourmet, but it was energy, heat, life. Fatty foods were especially prized. Fat burned slower than lean meat, keeping you warmer for longer. A belly full of stew, bread, and questionable lard wasn't just dinner. It was a tactical move. And if your dreams got weird from all the cabbage your stomach was trying to conquer in the dark, so be it. You were warm. Parents didn't play around with mealtime. If a kid didn't want their turnips, tough. They ate them anyway, because shivering all night was a much worse alternative. It wasn't gentle parenting. It was survival parenting. So picture it. A family bundled in itchy layers, lying side by side in a bed of straw, bellies full, a gently steaming cow snoring nearby, and a heated stone tucked under their feet. Outside, the wind howled like it wanted to tear the world apart. Inside, they had just enough warmth, just enough food, and just enough hope to make it to morning. That was winter in the medieval world. One breath, one meal, one clever trick at a time. A little cloud in the air, each heartbeat a quiet victory against the cold. In those fragile hours between dusk and dawn, the fire was more than just heat. It was hope, glowing faintly in the center of the room. Hot porridge wasn't just breakfast. It was a thermal tool. Cook a big batch, scoop some into a pot, and bury it in the hay box. Hours later, it was still warm enough to eat without having to spark the fire back to life. The hay box was the medieval slow cooker, but also a nighttime snack stash, and, occasionally, an improvised foot warmer, if placed just right. But food wasn't the only thing they kept warm this way. Once they figured out hay could trap heat, it didn't take long before someone thought, why not heat rocks? Thus began the age of the bedtime stone. Before sleep, someone, probably the youngest kid who lost the family standoff, had the glorious job of sticking a flat rock deep into the hearth. After it got almost too hot to touch, but not quite a third-degree burn hazard, they'd fish it out with tongues or whatever tool was least likely to cause injury. That stone, still radiating glorious warmth, was wrapped in rags or stuck in a pot, then buried under straw at the bottom of the bed. Instant heating pad. One step removed from curling up with an ember, but a lot safer, assuming you didn't mess it up. If you skipped a layer of cloth or got clumsy, congratulations, you now had a burn, a ruined blanket, or a small bed fire. But if you did it right, that hot stone could stay warm for hours, turning a freezing bed into a halfway tolerable one. It wasn't lavish, but when the wind was howling and the windows were just holes with cowhide nailed over them, not freezing counted as 5-star comfort. Then there was the hearth itself, the smoky, crackling heart of every peasant household. It wasn't just where meals were made. It was warmth, protection, the glow everyone gathered around, and the final line of defense against the night. Families didn't organize their sleeping spots by preference. It was all about survival strategy. The fragile, babies, the sick, the elderly got the best spots closest to the fire. Not because they were special, though sometimes they were, but because their bodies couldn't fight the cold on their own. Parents, older children, and the more robust adults formed a perimeter around them, human insulation layered like a blanket made of snores and wool cloaks. This wasn't generosity. It was practical warmth economics. But getting too cozy with the hearth had its risks. Roll too close and you might wake up with your tunic smoking or your eyebrows singed. Too far and you were back to shivering like a forgotten snowman. The heat didn't spread nicely. It hugged the front row and ignored everyone else. Sleeping next to the fire was a game of angles, like medieval heat Tetris. One side of you basked in the warmth while the other side froze solid. Even animals joined the nightly fire scramble. Dogs would sneak in and plop themselves down with tails dangerously close to the flames. Chickens sometimes roosted right on the warm stones, gently clucking like sleepy guardians of the hearth. Everyone, from toddlers to goats, wanted in on that tiny pool of heat. And in the quiet, as embers popped and the wind scratched at the walls, peasants drifted off. The fire cracked. The stones glowed faintly under layers of hay and cloth. Breaths puffed like smoke signals. No one slept deeply, but they slept. And every morning they woke up still warm, still alive. That was enough. That was everything. Keep the wind from sneaking in through the cracks. Others hung religious charms near doors or carved small crosses into beams. Little gestures meant to turn thin walls into something stronger than just mud and luck. When winter pressed in hard, belief became insulation too. Faith wasn't something peasants dusted off for holy days. It lived in their kitchens, their hay beds, and their frozen fingertips. It was in the whispered prayers for a healthy child, the muttered thanks over a bowl of hot stew, and the hopeful glances at a fire refusing to go out. When all else failed, there was always one last option: pray and keep breathing. Because in the medieval world, winter was never just about the cold. It was about endurance, about people clinging to each other, to warmth, to rituals, and to hope. No one survived on their own. Even the fiercest feuds took a break when frost threatened to take one of your own. If someone's chimney went cold, if a door stayed shut too long, someone always noticed, and someone always acted. Villages were scrappy networks of shared struggle. There were always watchers, those too young, too old, or too injured to work the land, but still sharp enough to notice when something was off. If the baker missed a morning or the blacksmith's forge sat cold, someone sent a child with fire or went knocking with a hunk of bread and a worried look. Even the smallest hands played a role. Kids carried firewood, passed around coals bundled in rags, and raced between homes delivering messages or help. They knew what was at stake. Everyone did. Winter didn't care if you were tired, angry, or holding a grudge. It only cared if you were weak. So no one got left behind, not if anyone could help it. Shared meals from scraped-together stores were common. If you were lucky, the village had dried beans, root vegetables, or the last string of sausage tucked away in a barn. If not, there was still thin broth, shared silence, and the kind of hunger that bonded people whether they liked it or not. And yes, tempers still flared. Arguments about borrowed tools, wandering goats, or fence lines didn't magically disappear. But grudges went on hold when a family's fire went out, or when someone didn't show up at the communal oven. You didn't leave a neighbor to freeze, even if they once stole your best ladle. Because the next night, it might be your fire that died, your door that wouldn't stay shut, your child coughing in the dark. In the heart of winter, villages became something more than just a collection of homes. They became a shared defense, a living, breathing structure built from hay, sweat, smoke, and a lot of stubborn hearts. No one survived winter alone. They did it together. One ember, one prayer, one muddy pair of boots at a time. Spirit. These weren't just people scraping by. They were people who refused to let the cold, the hunger, and the darkness take everything. They patched, prayed, shared, and scraped through each cruel winter, not because they were used to suffering, but because they believed, deep down, that spring would come eventually. Blessed chalk on doorways, candles flickering in the night, whispered deals with God. These weren't superstitions born from laziness or ignorance. They were rituals of hope, survival tactics passed down like family recipes. Every symbol scratched into a beam or muttered over a bowl of soup was a way to push back against the silence waiting just outside the walls. The village was their shield, their last defense. Everyone mattered. Everyone watched. Everyone helped when they could. And when the worst happened, when someone's fire went out or their food ran dry, it was a communal wound. You didn't leave people to freeze unless you truly had nothing left to give. And even then, it tore something out of you. Because the truth was brutal. Sometimes winter didn't care how many layers you wore or how much you prayed. Sometimes it stole everything, people, animals, homes, and left behind only silence. Whole families gone, houses caved in, fires that never sparked again. It happened. And somehow, year after year, the survivors dug themselves out and started over. Rebuilt walls, replanted fields, rekindled the flame. Frostbite and famine were the physical scars, but it was the emotional ones that ran deeper. Burying a child who caught a cough too soon, or finding your friend's house silent and cold after the snow melted. Still they pressed on, because life, even when clawing through the dirt for warmth, was worth the fight. So when we remember medieval peasants, let's not picture just the misery. Picture the strength, the cleverness, the way they turned hay and stone and prayer into tools of survival, the way they leaned on each other when the wind came clawing, the way they lit one more candle, wrapped one more coal, and said one more prayer just to make it through the night. They didn't have much, but what they did have, they used with everything they had. And that legacy of grit, of care, of unshakable perseverance burns far brighter than the darkness that tried to take them much. But beauty wasn't her weapon. Anne Boleyn had something far more dangerous: presence. Sharp, observant, and utterly self-assured, she walked into the court of Henry VIII not as a pawn, but as a player. Her time in Europe had crafted her into someone who didn't just fit into the English court, she challenged it. She had opinions, taste, and a kind of fearless charm that made people lean in when she spoke. Unlike many women of her rank, she didn't aim to please everyone. She aimed to stand out, and she did. By the time Henry noticed her, Anne had already turned heads. But she didn't rush to seize the opportunity. She refused to become just another mistress. She held her ground, not out of coyness, but calculation. And in doing so, she changed the rules of the game. Their courtship became the center of a national storm. Henry, obsessed, broke from the Pope to marry her, an act that shattered centuries of religious tradition and reshaped England forever. Anne wasn't just the spark that lit the English Reformation. She was its symbol. A queen not by birthright, but by sheer force of will. But power came at a steep cost. The same court that once adored her turned. Whispers grew louder. Enemies circled. When she failed to produce a male heir, the cracks widened. She was charged with adultery, incest, and treason, charges soaked in politics more than truth. In 1536, Anne was executed at the Tower of London, her head severed with a sword brought in from France. She died with dignity, her final words filled with grace and loyalty, even toward the king who betrayed her. Anne Boleyn's story didn't end with her death. It began there. Her daughter, Elizabeth Thirst, would go on to become one of England's greatest monarchs, a legacy Anne never lived to see, but helped to shape. So when we remember Anne Boleyn, we remember more than a queen who lost her head. We remember a woman who defied expectation, reshaped a kingdom, and proved that power doesn't always wear a crown from birth. Sometimes it's born in silence, shaped abroad, sharpened by wit, and carried with grace, until history has no choice but to take notice. Failed to give him a male heir. He argued that marrying his brother's widow had been a sin, that God was punishing him with a line of daughters and dead sons. Convenient theology, perhaps, but one that suited his obsession with Anne Boleyn. What followed was more than a royal breakup. It was a political earthquake. The Pope refused to grant an annulment. Catherine stood her ground, and Anne, unyielding as ever, waited. She would not become Henry's mistress. She would be his queen, or nothing at all. So Henry broke with Rome. With Anne at the center, he severed England from the Catholic Church, declared himself head of the Church of England, and bulldozed centuries of religious tradition, all to marry a woman who had refused to be just another name in his book of flirtations. In 1533, Anne and Henry wed in secret. Soon after, she was crowned queen. But power in Tudor England was never a steady throne. It was a razor's edge. The people who once whispered in awe now murmured with suspicion. Many still saw Catherine as the true queen, and Anne, once the court's dazzling storm, now faced a very different kind of pressure. She had won the crown, but now she had to produce a male heir. Instead, she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. Henry was disappointed, but hopeful. Then came miscarriages, whispers of bad luck, tensions at court. Anne, who had once outmaneuvered everyone, now found herself hemmed in by the very expectations she had defied. Enemies circled like vultures. The same charm that had once enthralled the king now irritated him. In 1536, just 3 years after her coronation, Anne was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason, most of which were flimsy, politically convenient lies. Her trial was swift. Her sentence was death. She faced the scaffold with the same courage she'd shown in life, graceful, composed, dignified to the end. Her head was severed in a single stroke by a French swordsman brought in for the task, a final gesture of Henry's twisted mercy. And yet, Anne Boleyn's true legacy didn't end there. Her daughter Elizabeth would grow into one of the most powerful and iconic monarchs in English history. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. Anne never lived to see her child's triumph, but it was the daughter of a controversial queen and a relentless king who would define an age. Anne Boleyn's life was brief, brilliant, and brutal. She wasn't perfect. She was sharp, ambitious, divisive, but she changed everything. She challenged a king, reshaped a kingdom, and became the mother of an era. She walked into history not as a quiet lady in waiting, but as a woman who bent the arc of power with her own hands. Not by being the most beautiful, not by being the most loved, but by refusing to be forgotten. When England broke from Rome, it wasn't just a political shift, it was a personal one. Henry VIII made himself head of the new Church of England, all so that Anne Boleyn's crown couldn't be questioned. She had climbed to the very top, reshaping a kingdom for love. But winning the throne was just the beginning. Holding on to it would be something else entirely. Anne's rise brought with it silent enemies. At court, allies turned cold, rivals hovered, and Henry, restless as ever, was already starting to look past the woman who had once lit up his world. Her victory should have been her moment of glory, but almost immediately cracks started to show. At the center of it all was one brutal truth. Anne hadn't given Henry the male heir he needed. Their first child, Elizabeth, was healthy and clever, but she wasn't the son the Tudor dynasty demanded. Anne went through pregnancy after pregnancy, but each ended in tragedy. Miscarriages left her weakened in body and spirit, and each loss chipped away at the future she had fought so hard to build. Henry, who had once been enthralled, began to drift away. The more disappointed he grew, the more distant he became. Anne, fiery and proud, didn't take this quietly. She argued, pleaded, demanded to be seen. But Henry had grown tired of her defiance. The same spark that once captivated him now felt like a burden. Meanwhile, her enemies were gaining confidence. Nobles who had once kept their opinions to themselves now conspired in plain sight. Catherine of Aragon's supporters had never forgiven Anne, and the public blamed her for the religious chaos sweeping the land. Whispers followed her everywhere. And then came Jane Seymour. Quiet, soft-spoken, everything Anne was not. While Anne had dazzled and provoked, Jane simply soothed. Henry was drawn to that calm. Anne saw it happening, saw the shift, and tried everything to turn things around. She flattered, promised sons, begged for time. But Henry's mind was already wandering toward life without her. Behind the scenes, her one-time ally, Thomas Cromwell, began working against her. Their partnership, once powerful, had soured. Anne pushed for reforms that threatened the rich and powerful. Cromwell wanted to keep things smooth and keep Henry's favor. They no longer wanted the same things, and that made Anne dangerous. With Henry's love fading and her influence slipping, her enemies moved in. There were no armies or battles, just quiet whispers, carefully planted lies, and secret meetings in the dark corners of court. Cromwell started pulling together rumors, building a case, gathering witnesses. Anne, once the woman who shook a kingdom, was now standing on shaky ground. In Henry's court, old victories didn't matter, only the next win counted, and Anne was out of time. Her crown had been won with daring, but it would not be kept with charm or even courage. The very court she had once conquered was now turning against her. As the rumors tightened around her like a noose, the woman who changed everything was about to be undone by the very forces she once controlled. Henry's court had grown hungry for a gentler, more obedient queen, and Jane Seymour, quiet, composed, and watchful, waited just beyond the spotlight. She was everything Anne wasn't, and exactly what Henry seemed to crave now. While Anne's fire flickered, Jane's calm presence promised peace, and Thomas Cromwell, ever the strategist, saw his moment. Henry was uneasy, restless, and looking for a way out, but not one that would damage his pride. Divorce would be messy and humiliating. Cromwell had a better idea. If Anne could be brought down, not through law, but through scandal, the king could be free with his dignity intact. So Cromwell moved first, planting the seeds of disgrace. The accusations he arranged were outrageous, shocking even by the standards of court gossip. Adultery, incest, treason. Anne, once hailed as a brilliant and bold queen, was now being painted as a seductress and a traitor. Cromwell built his case with ruthless efficiency, using torture to force confessions, twisting harmless gestures and conversations into evidence. Men were arrested, including Anne's own brother, George Boleyn. The charges were riddled with contradictions. The timelines didn't add up, and none of it made logical sense. But in Henry's England, the truth bent to the will of the crown. Anne, sensing the trap closing around her, tried to remind Henry of their past, the love, the sacrifices, but he wouldn't even meet her gaze. The man who had once changed a nation for her now turned away in silence. In May 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. As the gates clanged shut behind her, she understood exactly where she stood. She wasn't queen anymore. She was a prisoner, caught in a game she had once played better than anyone else. Soon after, Anne faced a panel of noblemen in the great hall of the Tower. Many of them owed their status and wealth to her rise, but now they were there to destroy her. They listened coldly as the charges were read: adultery, even with her own brother, treason, conspiracy. Things that once would have been unthinkable to accuse a queen of were now paraded as fact. The trial was never about justice. It was a performance, carefully staged to give Henry what he wanted: Anne's downfall under a cloak of legality. Still, Anne stood her ground. She defended herself with sharp wit and calm strength, denying every charge clearly and forcefully. She reminded them all of her coronation, her loyalty, her love for Henry and England. But it made no difference. The outcome had already been decided. Witnesses, many bribed or pressured, told lies. Details clashed. There was barely any real proof, but none of that mattered. Anne and the men accused alongside her, including George, were found guilty. Her sentence was beheading, a grim mercy, sparing her the horrific traitor's death that usually awaited those convicted of treason. As the sentence was read, Anne did not collapse. She stood tall, pale but unbroken, and spoke with dignity. She said she was ready to die and asked God for mercy. The heavy doors of the courtroom closed behind her, and the court let out a collective sigh. The woman who had once dazzled and defied them was almost gone. But what they didn't realize was that they weren't just ending her life, they were ensuring her legend. Anne Boleyn's story wouldn't end in that tower. It would live on in betrayal, in tragedy, and in history. Anne Boleyn entered the Tower of London, not in triumph, but in chains. She was no longer the queen who had once captivated a nation. She was a prisoner, condemned and waiting to die. But even as the end approached, Anne didn't collapse. She held herself together with a quiet strength that refused to break. Inside those cold stone halls, she spent her final days in prayer. Kneeling for hours on the hard floor, her hands tightly clasped, her voice steady, she confessed to nothing. She believed she had done no wrong. Death didn't scare her, she said. Her only hope was that it might bring peace to the country, and maybe somehow a little mercy for her young daughter, Elizabeth. The few ladies who had stayed by her side wept quietly, but Anne comforted them instead. Sometimes she joked, darkly, that she'd go down in history as the queen who lost her head. That sharp humor, even then, was a spark of the boldness that had once made her unstoppable. Meanwhile, Henry VIII had already moved on. Even before Anne's execution was set, he was planning his next wedding to Jane Seymour. For Anne, that must have been the cruelest blow. Not just betrayal, but replacement. The man who once shattered a kingdom to be with her now pushed her aside with barely a glance. On May 18th, Anne was told she would die the next morning. She didn't sleep much that night. Instead, she prayed, asking God to forgive those who had turned against her, and maybe even herself, for the ambition that had helped raise her so high and now brought her so low. Henry had, with what he might have called mercy, ordered a French swordsman to carry out the execution. It would be cleaner, quicker than the axe, less violent, though perhaps more for his peace of mind than Anne's comfort. At dawn, Anne dressed with care. She wore a dark gray gown of damask, lined with fur and a crimson underskirt, a quiet blend of dignity and sacrifice. She pinned her hair up and covered it with a simple cap. As she stepped into the cool morning mist that hung over the Tower courtyard, she walked with quiet resolve. No tears, no begging, only calm. On May 19, 1536, the scaffold stood ready. A small crowd had gathered, guards, courtiers, silent observers. Anne climbed the steps. She looked thinner, more fragile than she had at court, but her expression was composed. The wind tugged at her gown. There were no outbursts, no drama, only steady grace. She spoke briefly, choosing her words carefully. She didn't accuse anyone. She didn't defend herself. She asked for God's mercy and prayed for the king's health and happiness, the same man who had abandoned her. Her final act wasn't a confession. It was forgiveness. And in that moment, even those who had come to see her fall were moved. The executioner, brought all the way from France to ensure a clean strike, stepped forward. Anne knelt upright, her hands folded, her eyes raised. A white cloth was tied over them. She didn't flinch. The sword flashed once, silent and fast, and then it was done. Anne Boleyn, queen, mother, history maker, was gone. She was buried almost immediately in an unmarked grave on the Tower grounds. No coffin had been prepared, so she was laid to rest in a simple arrow chest. The woman once crowned in gold vanished without fanfare. But her story didn't end there. In the years to come, the daughter she had worried over, Elizabeth, would rise to take the throne. And in doing so, she would ensure that Anne Boleyn's legacy lived on, not just in tragedy, but in triumph. The child whose arrival had once left a king disappointed would one day become one of the most iconic rulers in English history. Elizabeth I, known as the Virgin Queen, ushered in a golden age for England. Her reign saw the rise of English power, the flourishing of the arts, and the beginning of global influence. She ruled with sharp intellect, fierce independence, and a resilience that echoed the spirit of her mother, Anne Boleyn. Anne had changed England forever. Her ambition helped spark the break from the Catholic Church and led to the creation of the Church of England. Her downfall proved that even a queen could be discarded when politics and power demanded it. Yet her legacy didn't end with her death. Through Elizabeth, Anne's influence lived on, greater than any crown she had ever worn. In the end, Anne didn't win survival. She won something far more lasting, a permanent place in history. More than 2 centuries later, another moment of transformation was brewing, this time across the Atlantic. By the early 1770s, tensions in the American colonies had reached a boiling point. What had once been a proud relationship with Britain had soured into distrust, anger, and a growing sense of betrayal. The trouble hadn't started with tea. Years earlier, the Stamp Act had lit the first sparks of resistance, taxing everything from newspapers to playing cards. Then came the Townshend Acts, adding duties on paper, glass, and paint. These weren't crushing taxes, but they weren't the issue. What outraged the colonists was the idea behind them, laws passed by a distant parliament thousands of miles away without any American voice or vote. At first, the colonies responded with petitions, boycotts, and pamphlets. Leaders like Samuel Adams and John Dickinson filled pages with powerful words about liberty, rights, and justice. Colonial assemblies drafted formal protests, hoping Britain would hear their message. Sometimes it seemed to work. The Stamp Act was repealed after widespread outcry, but with every small win came another blow. New laws, new taxes, new ways for Britain to tighten its grip. The pattern became clear. Parliament wasn't listening. Worse, it didn't seem to care. Boston, more than anywhere else, became the center of resistance. The Sons of Liberty, a secretive and defiant group of patriots, gained strength. Tensions finally burst into bloodshed in 1770, when British soldiers opened fire on civilians in the Boston Massacre. After that, any trust between the colonies and Britain was gone. By 1773, the colonies were on the brink. The spark that would set off open rebellion didn't come with guns or marching soldiers. It came quietly, in crates of tea stacked on British ships. Parliament believed it had found a solution with the Tea Act. The plan was to rescue the struggling British East India Company by letting it sell tea directly to the colonies, cutting out middlemen and dropping prices. It was, on paper, a bargain. Better tea for less money. But the colonists didn't care about the price tag. The issue wasn't the cost, it was what accepting the tea represented. The Tea Act left the tax on tea in place, and buying it would mean accepting Parliament's right to tax them without their say. The British thought they were offering a deal. What they were actually doing was daring the colonies to choose between submission and resistance. And when that tea ended up in the icy waters of Boston Harbor, the colonies made their choice. That night, without a single shot fired, the course of history changed. To many Americans, the idea that Parliament could impose laws and taxes without their consent wasn't just unfair, it was unbearable. It meant surrendering the very freedoms they'd been fighting to protect for over a decade. So when news of the Tea Act swept through the colonies, it wasn't just heard, it exploded. Merchants were furious. They saw the act as a direct threat to their livelihoods, fearing a monopoly by the East India Company would wipe out local business. Patriots were even more alarmed. To them, the message was loud and clear. The Crown still believed it had the right to rule the colonies by force and fiat. In Boston, where memories of the Boston Massacre and long economic struggles still lingered, the reaction was especially intense. People saw the Tea Act for what it was, a trap dressed up as a bargain. Rejecting the tea became more than just political protest. It became a statement of personal and patriotic honor. To accept the tea was to betray the cause of liberty. The colonies responded with forceful unity. Public meetings filled with fiery speeches, newspapers lit up with fierce words, and groups like the Sons of Liberty, led by men like Samuel Adams, mobilized boycotts. From New York to Charleston, ships carrying the controversial tea were met with resistance and turned away. The message was simple: we will not be bought. But in Boston, things took a different turn. 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, arrived and anchored in the harbor. They refused to leave. Royal officials demanded the tea be unloaded. The colonists refused. A standoff began, and with each passing day, tension coiled tighter. Boston became a city on the edge. The harbor wasn't just full of ships, it was full of pressure, waiting to explode. In taverns, churches, and crowded squares, angry voices debated what to do next. The Sons of Liberty acted quickly. They plastered the city with notices, organized loud public meetings, and called on every citizen to resist the British tea. The Old South Meeting House became the heart of the resistance. Thousands packed the wooden hall, their breath clouding the air, their voices rising in passionate defiance. Resolutions were passed. Emotions surged. Every vote against unloading the tea struck another blow against British authority. But time was running out. British law gave a 20-day deadline. If the tea wasn't unloaded and the tax paid by then, customs officials would seize the cargo and force the tax through. Even paying it under protest would be seen as submission. The Sons of Liberty knew this. They understood the stakes. It wasn't about tea anymore. It was about whether the colonies would accept being treated like subjects with no voice, or rise and claim their rights. Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to bend. He ordered the ships to stay put, insisting the law be followed. Letting the ships go without unloading would mean acknowledging mob rule, and to him that was unthinkable. He held his ground, even as the city boiled. All of Boston was watching. Everyone, from children to elders, could feel the shift in the air, that heavy electric stillness just before a storm breaks. The tension was everywhere, stretched thin over every conversation, every street corner. It only needed one spark. And somewhere in those crowded alleys and meeting halls, deep in the hearts of Boston's people, that spark was already beginning to glow. A quiet decision had been forming, one that would shake empires and ripple across oceans. On the gray, cold morning of December 16, 1773, Boston stood on the edge of something irreversible. For nearly 3 weeks, the 3 tea ships had sat in the harbor like loaded traps. Now the 20-day deadline had arrived. British law was clear. If the tea wasn't unloaded and the tax paid, customs could seize the cargo, and British troops could step in to enforce the law. Everyone in Boston knew it, and they knew that if the tea made it ashore, even once, the fight for liberty would lose its footing. Letting it happen meant surrendering to the idea that the crown could do as it pleased, without the colonists' consent. That morning, thousands packed the Old South Meeting House, the largest building in the city. Some had walked for miles through the frozen countryside just to be there. The place overflowed, with crowds spilling into the streets, straining to hear the voices rising from inside. Samuel Adams, the unshakable force behind the resistance, led the meeting. One by one, speakers stood to denounce the Tea Act, to rally against tyranny, to demand action. But despite the passionate words, a deep uncertainty still hovered. How could they stop the tea without triggering war? How could they resist without inviting brutal retaliation? Then, late in the afternoon, riders arrived with news. Governor Hutchinson was holding firm. The ships would not be allowed to leave without unloading. The cargo would be seized. The tax would be collected. The king's will would be enforced. Inside the meeting house, the atmosphere shifted. Tension crackled in the air. The crowd surged with anger. The building seemed to tremble under the weight of it. Then Samuel Adams stood once more and delivered a simple but decisive statement. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. Everyone understood. The time for talk had ended. Action was coming. From outside, a war whoop pierced the dusk. Men moved quickly, smearing soot on their faces, wrapping themselves in blankets, adding feathers to their hair. They weren't trying to pass as real Mohawk warriors. This was a symbol, a way of stepping beyond their old colonial identities, claiming a new one shaped by resistance. As night settled over Boston, the quiet streets came alive with shadows. Dozens of men moved silently toward Griffin's Wharf, where the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver waited. The harbor air was thick with winter's bite, the water cold and black beneath the ships. What followed was not chaos. It was deliberate and swift. The men climbed aboard, armed with hatchets and clubs. They didn't harm the sailors, they simply moved them aside, and then they began. With powerful blows, they smashed open the tea chests. The smell of fresh tea filled the night air. Crate after crate, 342 in all, was split open and dumped overboard. The tea hit the water with echoing splashes, swirling and sinking into the harbor like waves of defiance. This wasn't a drunken riot. It was a message, one that said clearly and without fear, the colonies would not be ruled without a voice. On that December night, Boston didn't just dump tea into the harbor, they threw the first blow in a revolution. Thousands of pounds of tea swirled through the black waters of Boston Harbor as the last broken chests hit the surface. Spectators stood silently along the wharf, watching the scene unfold in stunned stillness. British guards nearby made no move to stop it. Whether they were confused, sympathetic, or simply unwilling to risk a violent escalation, no one could say. Even among loyalists, there was a growing sense that something fundamental had shifted, and that it couldn't be undone. The discipline shown that night was remarkable. Not a single item was stolen. No one searched the ships for valuables. Only the tea, the symbol of British control, was touched. In a city gripped by daily hunger and hardship, the temptation to take more must have been strong. But the protesters made it clear. This wasn't theft, this was a statement. When it was over, the harbor looked like a vast cauldron. Chests bobbed in the water, their contents staining the waves a murky brown. The sharp scent of tea mixed with salt air, creating a strange, bittersweet fog that clung to the shoreline. Without a word, the men melted back into the shadows of Boston, slipping through alleyways and back streets. They left behind no names, no boasts, no claims, only the unmistakable imprint of revolution. As the last of the tea sank beneath the surface, Boston seemed to hold its breath. What had just happened wasn't chaos or riot, it was precision, purpose, and defiance. The harbor had become a giant teapot, its waters steeped in rebellion. Some curious townsfolk tried scooping up soggy leaves from the shore, but Sons of Liberty nearby stopped them firmly. Nothing was to be saved. No one was to benefit. This was about principle and nothing else. By morning, the air still smelled of salt and steeped tea. Word spread fast, on the streets, in letters, in hastily printed broadsheets. By midday, everyone from apprentices to shopkeepers knew what had happened. Reactions split sharply. Among patriots there was pride, deep, blazing pride. Ordinary colonists had challenged the most powerful empire on earth and sent a clear message: they would not submit. Loyalists and moderates, however, were horrified. To them it was lawless destruction, a dangerous path with no return. Had the colonies gone too far? Governor Thomas Hutchinson seethed in his home, not just over the ruined cargo, but over what it symbolized. If the king's authority could be so boldly defied in Boston, what was to stop rebellion elsewhere? British officials were stunned. They had expected resistance, petitions, boycotts, perhaps even another riot. What they hadn't expected was the calm, methodical destruction of royal property carried out by masked men who didn't smash a single window. The captains of the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver could only stand by helplessly as their ships were emptied into the sea. On paper, the losses would be recorded at over £10,000, a massive sum. But the real cost couldn't be measured in money. The true damage was to British authority, to the illusion that the colonies were still governed by consent. The night the tea sank, something deeper rose, a shared understanding that peaceful protest was nearing its end. The colonies had drawn a line, and Boston had taken the first step across it. When news of the Boston Tea Party reached London, the response was swift and furious. British leaders didn't see it as a protest. They saw rebellion, a direct challenge to the Crown's power, a declaration that control was slipping through their fingers. The attack on royal authority could no longer be ignored. When King George III received word of the Boston Tea Party, he reportedly grew cold with fury. In Parliament, already impatient with years of colonial defiance, anger exploded. Boston wouldn't just be punished, it would be made an example, a warning to every other colony. The result was a series of harsh new laws that colonists quickly dubbed the Intolerable Acts. The first blow came fast and hard. The Boston Port Act slammed shut the city's harbor, its lifeline of commerce and trade. Until the destroyed tea was paid for and order restored, no ships could come or go. Goods vanished. Supplies dried up. The once bustling docks fell silent, and a heavy stillness settled over the city. But that was just the beginning. Next came the Massachusetts Government Act, which stripped the colony of its right to self-rule. The king's appointed officials would now govern directly. The Administration of Justice Act followed, allowing royal officials accused of crimes to be tried back in Britain, far from colonial juries. A clear message that British authorities were above the law. To enforce these changes, British troops were quartered across Boston. Soldiers now lived among the people they were sent to control. The message was chilling. Rebellion would be crushed, and liberty was no longer up for discussion. Yet Britain's crackdown didn't break the colonies. It bound them together. What was meant to frighten others into obedience had the opposite effect. As news of Boston's punishment spread, its harbor closed, its people hungry under martial law, sympathy turned into outrage. Colonies that had once seen Boston's troubles as distant now saw their own futures reflected in its suffering. Wagon loads of food and supplies began pouring into Boston from neighboring colonies. Letters of support and pledges of unity crossed colonial borders. Secret meetings were held in churches, inns, and town halls. The colonies, once divided by distance and difference, were beginning to unite. Britain had hoped to isolate Boston. Instead, they made it a symbol. A city punished not just for rebellion, but for standing up. From Virginia to New Hampshire, South Carolina to Pennsylvania, Americans realized that if Parliament could silence Boston, they could silence anyone. What began as a local protest had become a national cause. By September 1774, the colonies took a step no one had dared before. Delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. For the first time, leaders who had once been known only in their own regions, men like George Washington, Patrick Henry, John Adams, and Samuel Adams, stood side by side. Officially, they weren't calling for independence. Not yet. But something bigger was already taking shape. The colonies had found common ground. They were no longer just 13 separate voices. They were becoming one. Most colonists still held out hope for reconciliation. They dreamed of restoring the old relationship, a partnership built on mutual respect under the British Crown. But beneath the surface of polite speeches and formal petitions, something deeper was beginning to grow. The colonies were starting to realize they couldn't afford to stand alone. At the First Continental Congress, delegates agreed to a sweeping boycott of British goods and pledged support for one another in the face of further aggression. They made it clear, an attack on one colony would be treated as an attack on all. Across taverns, town halls, and meeting houses, words that once felt dangerous began to flow freely: unity, resistance, liberty. In punishing Boston, Britain had tried to crush rebellion. Instead, it had done the opposite. The hammer meant to break had forged bonds. Colonists who once saw themselves as Virginians, New Yorkers, or Carolinians began to think of themselves as something else entirely: Americans. The winds of revolution weren't just stirring anymore, they were howling, and it was already too late for Britain to stop them. The night the tea sank in Boston Harbor, it wasn't just cargo that was lost. It was the illusion that the colonies could stay loyal subjects forever. That night, a spark lit that no king, no army, no faraway parliament could ever extinguish. In the months that followed, that spark turned into flame. Protests hardened into open defiance. Militias began drilling in broad daylight. Gunpowder and shot were quietly stored away. Men who once toasted the king now whispered of revolution. Boston, battered but unbowed, became a powerful symbol, proof that resistance was possible. Every ship that passed the city's silent, closed harbor carried a message. The Crown's grip was slipping. The intolerable acts were supposed to scare the colonies into submission. Instead, they made Boston a martyr and inspired unity from Georgia to New Hampshire. What had started as a fight over tea was now a fight for survival, identity, and freedom. By the spring of 1775, tension exploded just outside Boston, in the small villages of Lexington and Concord. British soldiers sent to seize weapons instead met lines of armed farmers, ordinary men ready to defend their rights. Muskets fired, blood was spilled. The American Revolution had begun. And it all traced back to that cold night in December, when men stood on a dock, made their choice, and dumped a king's tea into the sea. That moment didn't come with fanfare. There were no grand speeches or waving flags, just quiet determination, fierce principle, and the courage to defy. The Boston Tea Party wasn't just about taxes. It was the beginning of a rejection, of monarchy, of distant rule, of being treated as subjects. The road ahead would be long, bloody, and uncertain. But after that night, one thing was certain. The American colonies were no longer subjects of an empire. They were something new. They were revolutionaries, and they were just getting started. Then, for centuries, it vanished, swallowed by sand, forgotten by time, lost to history so completely that the world didn't even know it had existed. The Soup Valley, where Carral once thrived, seemed like the last place a great civilization could have taken root. The land is dry and harsh, a sun-beaten expanse of rock and dust. The river that winds through it is narrow, more silver thread than lifeline. To most, it looked like a place abandoned by life, but hidden in that barren valley, one of humanity's first cities had once stood. Carral wasn't just a scattering of huts or a seasonal camp. It was a planned city, deliberate, complex, and monumental. It stretched across more than 150 acres, with towering pyramids, wide plazas, ceremonial platforms, and neighborhoods carefully arranged. This wasn't a village. It was a civilization. Long before the Egyptians began building their pyramids, the people of Kerala were already shaping massive structures from stone and earth, without metal tools, without writing, without the wheel. They used nothing but human effort, shared vision, and the kind of organization that hinted at deep intelligence and unity. And yet, for millennia, Kerala lay silent. Its massive structures, eroded by time, were mistaken for hills, just weathered mounds shaped by wind and sun. Nobody guessed that beneath the surface was one of the oldest urban centers in the world, older even than many of the civilizations long thought to be the first. It wasn't until the late 20th century that archaeologist Ruth Shady and her team uncovered the truth. What they found buried in the dust didn't just reshape the story of the Americas. It forced the world to rethink its entire understanding of how and where civilization began. Kerala had lived, thrived, and vanished without leaving behind grand conquests or war stories. What it left was a legacy of balance, ingenuity, and quiet brilliance. At first glance, the Soup Valley still looks like a place where nothing should grow. The wind howls across the cracked earth. The sun scorches everything it touches. The river, when it appears, seems barely able to keep flowing. But where others saw a wasteland, the people of Kerala saw opportunity. They looked at that thin river not as a limitation, but as a beginning. With patience and innovation, they tamed its seasonal floods. They dug channels and carved irrigation paths, turning the valley floor into fertile land. Where there had been dust, green things began to grow. They cultivated squash, beans, guava, sweet potatoes, and above all, cotton. Cotton became their gold. They spun it into strong fishing nets and woven textiles, which they traded with coastal villages, building connections far beyond the valley. But their achievements went far beyond agriculture. They understood survival required harmony. Their buildings were designed to withstand extreme conditions, heat, wind, and the rare but powerful rains. They worked with the land, not against it, shaping their homes and temples with local stone and earth. They also looked to the skies. They observed the stars and tracked the seasons, timing their plantings and harvests with astonishing precision. Theirs was a society deeply attuned to both the earth beneath their feet and the sky above their heads. Kerala was more than just a city. It was a marvel of cooperation, science, and sustainability, rising in a place where civilization seemed impossible. And as its story slowly emerges from the sand, we're only beginning to understand what this lost world has to teach us. Astronomers and traders helped form the lifeblood of Kerala, with networks of exchange pulsing up and down the Peruvian coast like arteries through a living body. Dried fish, cotton, fruits, and handmade goods flowed outward, while colorful shells from the Pacific, rare stones from the Andes, and distant ideas made their way in. Kerala was no isolated outpost. It was a hub, a vibrant, connected city that thrived not in spite of its harsh environment, but because its people learned how to live with it. In a land where survival seemed improbable, Kerala endured through wisdom, invention, and unity. The people didn't try to dominate the desert. They worked with it, reading its rhythms, respecting its power, and creating something far beyond survival. They built a civilization that was functional, yes, but also deeply sophisticated. Against all odds, Kerala didn't just survive, it flourished, and it was only just beginning. Rising from the desert like ancient sentinels, the pyramids of Kerala challenge everything we thought we knew about early civilization in the Americas. These were no rough piles of stone, but grand architectural achievements, built with purpose and vision by a people who understood scale, structure, and the stars. At the heart of it all stood the Pyramide Mayor, the largest of Kerala's monumental buildings. Stretching over 450 feet long and standing nearly 60 feet tall, it was a stunning feat of engineering, rivaling the early wonders of the ancient world. Constructed from stone, mud, and reed-wrapped stones, it wasn't just built to impress, it was built to last, designed to resist earthquakes and weather the test of time. And it did, standing for nearly 5,000 years. Yet unlike the pyramids of Egypt, Kerala's pyramids weren't tombs. They were places of life, of ceremony, ritual, leadership, and gathering. Grand staircases led to flat platforms where fires once burned and people came together under the open sky. At the base, vast sunken plazas welcomed thousands for celebrations, spiritual observances, and civic affairs. Everything in Corral's design reflected a society centered on connection between people and between people and the cosmos. The city unfolded with intentional order, pyramids strategically placed and aligned with astronomical events, surrounded by residential quarters for priests, artisans, and administrators. The structures weren't just shelters or symbols of power. They were cosmological tools, markers of the sun, the solstices, the stars. Walking through Corral today, the precision is striking. These monuments were raised without metal tools, without wheels, without pack animals, and yet they stand in harmony, balanced, symmetrical, and precise. They weren't built for war or ego. They were built to bring earth and sky together, to link humanity with something greater and more eternal. And still, Corral whispers through the dust. Among its ruins is something quietly revolutionary, something that sets it apart from many ancient civilizations. There are no weapons, no defensive walls, no mass graves or signs of battle. Corral left no evidence of war or conquest. Its greatness was not carved through violence. Instead, this was a society built on peace, a civilization that rose and thrived through cooperation, trade, and shared knowledge. While empires elsewhere expanded with bloodshed and crumbled in conflict, Corral built something different, a world founded on balance, purpose, and the collective will to create. It's a reminder that one of the world's first great cities didn't conquer to rise. It listened, learned, and built together. And in doing so, it left behind a story too powerful to be buried forever. Belief shaped everything in Corral. The people didn't invest their energy in armies or fortresses, but in architecture, astronomy, music, and communal life. Their pyramids and plazas weren't tributes to conquest. They were places to come together, to celebrate, to worship, to govern. This was a civilization that gathered rather than fought, that traded rather than took, and that thrived through balance, not brutality. Corral's success flowed from its deep networks of trade. Cotton grown along the fertile riverbanks was spun into fishing nets, which were exchanged with coastal communities for dried fish, an essential protein source. In return, Corral welcomed goods from across the region, bright shells from the Pacific, polished stones from the Andes, even rare fruits from distant valleys. These exchanges weren't just economic, they created bonds, a web of mutual reliance that helped maintain peace. At the heart of this web stood Corral, not only as an economic hub, but as a cultural and spiritual center. Its plazas and ceremonial spaces were designed for gathering, likely hosting large rituals that brought people together in shared belief. Music played a vital role. Flutes carved from condor and pelican bones, drums stretched with deer hides, and whistles made from antlers filled the desert air with rhythm and meaning. These sounds weren't background. They were the voice of the city itself. Leadership in Corral seemed grounded in wisdom and organization rather than fear or military might. Its rulers must have overseen everything from agricultural cycles to large-scale building projects, coordinating trade, construction, and religious life. Yet there is no evidence of war, no signs of mass violence, no scars of conquest. In a world where power often meant domination, Corral stood apart as proof that a civilization could rise through cooperation and trust. The stones of Corral still seem to hum with echoes from a time when society moved to a different rhythm. It wasn't just a city of walls and markets. It was alive with music, ceremony, and shared purpose. Archaeologists working carefully through its dry sands uncovered a stunning collection of instruments: bone flutes, antler whistles, and animal skin drums, all carefully made, tuned to carry their sound across plazas and into the hearts of the people. In a world without written language, music became the universal tongue. It was how stories were told, how rituals were shared, how people connected to each other and to the divine. Picture it. As dusk settled over the desert, the low beat of drums rising like thunder, flutes singing with the wind, the rhythm of feet echoing in the plaza. Above, fires flickered on the pyramid platforms. Priests in woven robes chanted prayers to the gods of water, earth, and stars. In those moments, Corral became more than a city. It became a living symphony. The city's design makes it clear. Ritual life was central. The grand plazas weren't just open space. They were purpose-built stages for ceremony. The sunken circular courts acted like ancient amphitheaters, focusing sightlines and amplifying sound. And towering above it all were the pyramids, not as tombs of the dead, but as living mountains connecting earth and sky. These sacred spaces likely marked the cycles of nature, the changing seasons, the planting and harvest, the movement of the stars overhead. Music was more than expression. It was a tool, a guide, a way to mark time and bring people together in collective rhythm. Chorale's greatness wasn't built on domination. It was built on harmony between people, with nature, and through sound. In a world so often shaped by conquest, chorale remains a rare and shining reminder that civilization can also rise through peace, creativity, and shared belief. Music in chorale was never just entertainment. It was a bridge between people, between nature and the divine, between the known and the unknowable. Unlike many ancient societies, chorale left behind no violent murals, no depictions of warlike gods, no evidence of blood-soaked sacrifice. Instead, its spiritual world appears to have been one of harmony, celebration, and reverence. Even today, when the wind sweeps through the ruins, it's easy to imagine the echoes, the faint rhythm of flutes, the soft beat of drums, the forgotten songs of a people who found meaning, beauty, and connection in the middle of a harsh, unyielding land. But carol was more than music and ritual. It was an engineering marvel, proof of what human creativity can accomplish even in the most unforgiving environments. Without metal tools, wheels, or draft animals, its people built a city of stone and earth that has lasted nearly 5,000 years. Towering pyramids didn't rise from fragile bricks, but from massive stones, some carried across the valley in reed bags woven from river plants. These baskets, surprisingly strong, were essential to their construction process, layer by layer, stone by stone. The people of Chorale didn't just build big, they built smart. Earthquakes often rattle the Soup Valley, yet Chorale's pyramids and plazas have survived almost entirely intact. Their secret? A deep understanding of the land. Builders used flexible construction techniques, wide foundations, layered fills, and rounded corners that allowed their structures to absorb and dissipate seismic energy. This wasn't theory. It was hands-on engineering, developed through generations of living with the earth, not against it. Water, too, was managed with incredible care. Despite being in a desert, the people of Chorale developed complex irrigation systems. They built channels and canals that diverted and controlled the seasonal flows of the river, ensuring crops could grow even in dry months. Not a drop was wasted. Every canal was purposeful, every turn and slope carefully designed. The layout of the city showed the same thoughtfulness. Major buildings were aligned with the movements of the sun, suggesting a detailed understanding of astronomy. The sunken plazas weren't just places to gather, they were tools for tracking time. Their shape and structure allowed priests and astronomers to observe the skies, predict the seasons, and plan harvests. Chorale was laid out like a living organism. Residential areas, administrative buildings, and ceremonial centers all woven together in harmony. Sacred space and daily life weren't separate. They were parts of a whole. Everything worked in balance. They built not just for now, but for the generations to come. Today, even modern engineers are astonished by Chorale's resilience. In a world often defined by technology, Chorale reminds us that true wisdom can come from listening to the land. Its stones have weathered quakes, storms, and centuries of time. They stand as a monument to a civilization that didn't impose its will on nature, but learned to move with it. For centuries, Chorale thrived. It was a beacon of peace, music, trade, and brilliant architecture in the middle of the desert, and then it was gone. Its fall left almost no trace. No fire-blackened ruins, no toppled walls, no bodies scattered across battlefields. The city was not conquered. It was simply left behind. Its plazas emptied. Its flutes fell silent. Its pyramids stood alone, slowly buried by the drifting sands. Why they left remains one of the great mysteries. No clear answer, only whispers and theories. Some scholars believe environmental change played a role. Final blow, evidence suggests, may have come in the form of a prolonged drought. Without the river's life-giving flow, Chorale's carefully balanced agricultural system would have collapsed. Fields withered, and the surplus crops that once fueled trade, cotton, fruits, produce, dwindled. As the food and fiber economy dried up, so too did the trade routes that once pulsed with activity. Other theories suggest a gradual shift in trade and power. As new cultures rose along the coast and inland, Chorale may have been edged out. Goods that once held value, like cotton and dried fish, might no longer have been enough to keep the city at the center of regional commerce. Slowly, the economic lifeblood drained away. Still others point inward. Without written records, we're left to imagine possibilities: political discord, spiritual unrest, or the slow fatigue of a society that had grown for centuries. Even peaceful civilizations can falter when survival becomes a daily struggle. Whatever the cause, Corral's end wasn't marked by flames or conquest. It was quiet. Families likely left gradually, drifting away in search of more fertile valleys and stronger rivers. Children who once played in its plazas grew up remembering stories of a fading city, and then in time, stopped telling them. The desert took back what had been built. Wind and sand covered pyramids, buried flutes, silenced drums. The city that had once sung with life became still. For nearly 4,000 years, Corral remained hidden, a hum beneath the sand. To travelers in the Soup Valley, the rounded mounds looked like nothing more than hills, shaped by time and wind. No one imagined that beneath their feet lay one of the oldest cities in the world. That changed in the late 20th century. In the 1990s, Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady led a team into the Soup Valley, drawn by a quiet suspicion that these strange formations might be something more. What they uncovered would rewrite history. Carefully, layer by layer, they brushed away the dust, and beneath it rose walls of cut stone, staircases, sunken plazas, and pyramids. A city lost to time, older than anyone had dared imagine. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the impossible. Corral was over 4,600 years old. It had flourished at the same time as the great civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt. Yet here it was, in the Americas, proving that complex urban life, monumental architecture, and social order had developed independently, long before the rise of the Inca or Maya. Corral shattered old assumptions. Until its discovery, scholars believed civilization in the Americas was younger, always a step behind the so-called Old World. Corral changed that. It showed that innovation, complexity, and cultural richness were not imported. They were born here too. Ruth Shady and her team didn't just find ruins, they found life. Musical instruments, fishing nets, textiles, quipas, ancient knot records, offerings left in sacred spaces. Each artifact told a story. Not just of survival, but of vision, beauty, and brilliance. Corral's rediscovery was more than an academic triumph. It was a reawakening. A reminder that the roots of civilization stretch deep into unexpected soil. That peace, creativity, and unity can shape greatness. And that even in silence, some voices wait patiently across millennia to be heard again. Resurrection. A civilization that had slumbered beneath the desert for thousands of years now stood once more beneath the open sky. The same winds that once carried music and laughter through Corral's plazas now swept over its stones again. The silence had lifted, and the city was speaking. Today, Corral is honored as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a delicate, priceless thread connecting us to humanity's earliest dreams of what it means to build, to belong, to believe. The sands buried it well, but the stones endured, waiting patiently for someone to notice, to listen, to remember. Corral rises today like a silent giant, reminding us that the roots of civilization go far deeper than we once imagined. Among its pyramids and plazas, in the carved staircases and sunken courts, the past whispers a new story, one not of conquest or destruction, but of harmony, intelligence, and hope. Long before the rise of Greece, Rome, or even Egypt, the people of Corral were building something extraordinary. Without the wheel, without metal, without written language, they raised pyramids. They mapped the stars. They created a thriving, complex society shaped by music, ritual, trade, and engineering, without scarring the land with war. In an ancient world so often defined by violence, Corral offered a different vision. A society built not on conquest, but on connection. Not on force, but on understanding. Its people showed that sophistication and peace could coexist, that greatness didn't have to be measured by the size of armies, but by the strength of a community working in harmony. Corral's legacy stretches far beyond the dry floor of the Soup Valley. It challenges the old idea that civilization had only one birthplace, one model. It proves that humanity's drive to create, to celebrate, to connect, to reach for the heavens, took shape in many places, in many forms, all across the world. Different hands, the same hopes. And if you walk among Corral's ruins today, you might still catch echoes of that life. The pulse of distant drums, the soft breath of flutes, the quiet murmur of traders, and the bright laughter of children running between the stones beneath a sky filled with stars. Their stories didn't disappear. They remain, etched into the bones of the earth. Carol teaches us that even when cities fall and memories fade, the spirit of a people can endure, resting beneath the sands, waiting to rise, to be remembered, to inspire once more. In the vast sweep of human history, Coral doesn't just shine as a relic of the past. It shines as a beacon for the future, a quiet reminder that even in the harshest places, under the heaviest burdens, the seeds of wisdom, beauty, and peace can take root and build a world that reaches for the stars.